We are in week 2 of our February read for 2024, which means we are still talking about God's control over history. That's sort of the big prophetic theme that we're working right now. And remember along the way that we're also reading through the book of Amos, which is there on the title slide, as you can see. So doing both of those pieces as we do some work in the prophets this year. So you chose to work this theme a little more, God's control over history.
Right.
You chose Isaiah 10.
Right.
Not a big surprise. You picked Cyrus last week. This week,
the Assyrians.
You're thinking about Assyria. So let's knit that together with this big idea of God ruling history.
Yeah, so last week was just kind of a big introduction to just how thoroughly God controls history. One of the greatest passages that demonstrates that, where God literally talks about what he's going to do through Cyrus, centuries before Cyrus is even born, that he can call him by name. Cyrus is going to be the rise of the Persians. Right. Assyria is still a current empire. The Babylonians haven't even come yet. God is literally, so just to show how thoroughly he can control history by naming someone whose great-grandparents haven't even been born yet, so forth. So that was last week. Part of what this week adds to that, though, in Isaiah chapter 10, is now we're going to talk about the Assyrians. God is going to talk about the Assyrians, who are the dominant empire of Isaiah's own day. He's back in Isaiah's own lifetime, Isaiah's own current events. But part of what he's going to show, there's a couple of important things that this passage adds, one of which is that even as God uses the Assyrians in history, they don't realize that they're being used by God. They think they're just conquering the world, and for them it's about
just
money.
Just out beating up people.
Yeah, taking their lunch money, right?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
about it's
they're
about
the
money
bully,
and
current
power.
Bully.
Right. It's chapter 10, verse 7. But he, Assyria, does not so intend. His heart does not so think that God is in control or that God is using him. He just sees it as he is powerful, he is able, and he is getting rich and so forth out of it. And so part of what we're learning here is that often as history unfolds, those whom God are using, because they are usually unbelievers, they have they think they're just doing it for themselves, even as they are prosperous for a season. They have no idea that they're actually fitting into God's plan.
Right.
There's no God consciousness in them. And so that's the first thing that this adds is, you can keep on reading the newspaper or reading the history books or taking the history classes, and we will tell in our culture the story of history, as though it's about powerful people and it's about, nations rise and fall because of economic reasons or political reasons or all of this. And the truth of the matter is we can get sucked into seeing history the same way that the Assyrians did or the Babylonians did or the Persians did, which is just, we're the most powerful nation, that's why we do what we do, or we're the most economically successful nation, that's why we do what we do, and it's really God using them the whole time.
In fact, it's interesting that as you read on through this segment that you've assigned us, we're supposed to read from chapter 10 and verse 5 down to verse 19. Right. And one of the things he's going to go on to say in this segment is, I'm going to deal with Assyria too.
Right.
And they think that they're doing this by their power and by their strength, but the truth is I'm just using them to deal with my people, and they're going to have their own wickedness, and I will come and I will bring them down too.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Even though God uses a people or a nation for a season, it doesn't mean that they're righteous or that they're more deserving or entitled, which is something that people like us in our nation ought to realize. It's just that for God, in the mysteries of his own counsel, his own purposes, chose this people in this time to be the rod of his anger, to bring judgment against, in this case, a sinful Israel who had broken her covenant with God. So that, again, the irony is, even though Assyria seems so powerful, we still teach about Assyria in world history textbooks, whereas we ignore Israel, because they weren't powerful. The reality is, in God's telling of history, it really was always about Israel. Israel needed judgment, so God raised up an empire to judge them, to punish them. But it was really always about Israel in God's eyes. That's the center of the story.
Yeah. What's really great about working through the period of the prophets and then right up into the time of the coming of Christ is we have sort of this 10,000 foot view of what's happening, literally,
Right.
as four great empires of the period rise and fall: Assyria, then Babylon, then the Medo-Persian, then the Romans.
Right.
Daniel's image being
Yeah.
recreated there. We have an opportunity to actually watch how God works and brings about the events that contribute to accomplishing His purposes. We have that 10,000 foot view that at that time, folks didn't have any sense of at all. I mean, think about the Assyrians. For them, Israel's nothing.
Right.
Israel factors into to broader world history mainly because they were in the way. Usually it's one of the big empires wanting to mess with Egypt, and Israel just happens to be along the way.
They're just a buffer state in between great powers.
So in the minds of the ancient people, to think that the God of the Hebrews was relevant at all would have been a joke to them.
Right.
And yet in reality, He is the one that's actually running the whole show, which is where I think this becomes really relevant for all of us in current circumstances. Maybe we should have waited and posted this video like in October of this year with the election coming in. We get so concerned about world leaders, don't we? So concerned about who's running this country, who's running that country, especially who's going to run our country, who's going to sit in the White House.
Right.
And I think in all of that, we forget, which is what the prophets help us with, we forget that it's not really important who's sitting in the White House.
Right.
It's that God sits on the throne of heaven.
Right.
And will work all things out according to His purposes. I don't think we remember that when we get fretful about our nation.
And by the same token, we take our daily intake of news from whatever source, whatever cable news network, whatever websites.
I get all mine off Facebook because I need a really reliable source.
Exactly. But wherever we're getting our daily dose of current events, that does then work us up emotionally, whether it causes us to get angry that we've got to change things or take the country back, or whether it causes us fear and anxiety because we're worried about our kids or our grandkids and the economy for their sake, or whatever it is. Part of what this also reminds us is that the real point of history, then and now, is the accomplishment of God's purposes. And God's purposes in this era was working up to the Messiah, and in our era is working out from the Messiah. So in other words, even as things, and things did get bad, the Assyrians crushed Israel, the Babylonians, they came along and crushed Judah, and the Persians kind of gave them a little bit of freedom back, but it wasn't really a great time. The Greeks come along and almost try to commit genocide against the Jews. Then comes the Romans, and we all know how happy the Jews were under the Romans. So there's all these, they are the people of God still, under all these difficult seasons and world powers, and yet God does not ultimately let His promises fail, despite the fact that in any particular generation, it may have looked rough and it may have looked dark. Right. The reality is the Messiah did come. God never lost track of His people, the family of David. The Messiah does come. He does offer us forgiveness of sins, which is the real work of God in history, to save us out of history, not fix history.
We forget about that.
We forget that. Too, yeah. And so now, even still today, while we're spiritual Israel, not physical Israel, we need to remember that just like God never lost track of physical Israel, and really He was working to save the world through this tiny little group of people steamrolled by history, so too now the church, spiritual Israel, that's where God's eye really is in the movement of Russia and Ukraine and Gaza and Israel and you and me in the United States, and here. God's eye is really on spiritual, the church, and the church accomplishing His purposes in history, even if CNN and Fox News never notice that.
Yeah, I think that the point isn't don't care about politics.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
If you want to pick someone you think is going to get us a little closer where we ought to be than where we are, more power to you and all of that. I guess the main point is we ought to look at all this and not fret so much.
Keep it in perspective.
About that's exactly right. Keep it within perspective that whoever ends up in the White House, God's still on the throne. And in times of upheaval and uncertainty, that ought to give us a lot of peace and comfort. And He's still going to work things out for our good in the end if we will be faithful and walk with Him. And that, to me, seems to be the thing to be a whole lot more concerned about than how things are going to shake out in the in the Super Tuesday primaries and things like that. So.
And to remember that, in God's eyes, real prosperity is the spiritual fruit of the gospel spreading, not, getting the GDP growth rate back to where it needs to be. That in God's eyes is what history is really about.
We need to be way more concerned about that. That's such a great point. So as you're reading here in Isaiah this week, watch God work and be comforted that he is still on the throne in heaven and he is still running the show. And remember along the way to spend some time reading through the book of Amos as well as we're working that minor prophet. Hope you enjoy your read this week.